say that we're very happy to see everybody at the first of these meetings, where we've decided to go or to ask people if they want to be more personal and let us know their history, background, and so on, rather than just the families, which we've written about often. So we said that's why Sheila suggested let's call it Getting to Know You, because we know Judy, we know her from her work at the synagogue, we know Judy from her work in Roehampton, but
the Israeli committee.
And the Israel committee, but what else? What do we know of Judy and her background? So now's a chance for us to learn and for Judy to say and to be the center of attention, which some of us like at some stage or other, don't we? But
So thank you very much for inviting me. It really is a privilege. You know, everybody's listening to me. Wow. I've been asked to talk for 10 to 15 minutes and then take questions. So I'll give you a quick spin through my life, and then I'm happy to expand on anything else you want to know more about. So I'll start with my parents. Where did they come from and how did they get together? My mum, Judy Weleminsky, was born in a little town called Pless in 1915, which then was in Upper Silesia. Well, I guess it still is, but it was part of Germany. Now it's part of Poland and has an unpronounceable name in Polish. Her father, my grandfather, Rabbi Arthur Löwenstam, was rabbi in Pless, and then he moved with the family to Spandau, a suburb of Berlin. His synagogue in Spandau was burned down on Kristallnacht, and he was taken to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Thankfully, at that stage, they weren't killing camps, and if you were able to get out of the country, you were released. So thankfully, the family were able to flee to London shortly after that. My father, Dr. Anton Weleminsky, was born in 1908 and was from a secular Jewish family living in Prague. And having trained as a doctor, he fled with his parents to London in 1939. And my parents were introduced by a family friend here in London, and they got married in Richmond Synagogue. But the synagogue wasn't then where it is now, it was where Waitrose is. So I can say they walked down the aisle in Waitrose. So where was I raised? Well, initially my father's medical qualifications were not recognised, but then during the war they were. But after the war he had to do the 6-month residencies as if he was a newly qualified doctor. And as a result, they lived for short periods in lots of out of the way places. My elder sister was born in London and my elder brother was born in Heswall, but I was born in Wolverhampton. When I was 5, we moved to Pontefract, which is why many people detect a northern or Yorkshire lilt in my accent when I speak. We lived there until I was 17 and we attended Sinai Synagogue, Reform Synagogue in Leeds. My mother ensured we were religiously Jewish and kept a kosher home, even though we lived out in the sticks and we were the only Jewish family in our town. Famously, my mother kept chickens and would take a live chicken to the shochet in Leeds. That was 3 buses and a 1.5-hour journey away. I believe the live chickens tried to escape a couple of times, which must have been fun. Although my Hebrew was very poor, one Hebrew sentence I did know was Imma balol, which I believe means Mum is in the chicken run. I'll have to ask Ella and David if I got that right.
Imma balul, Imma balul.
Ah, I've been saying it wrong all these years. I had my bar mitzvah at Sinai Synagogue and also later a ceremony which was then called Bat Torah for 16 to 17-year-olds. I went to Birmingham University to study psychology. That was despite my headmistress at school being appalled at the idea of me studying psychology. Well, I'm not a girl studying psychology before, she said. And my father predicted that I'd never get a job with that useless degree, but it didn't stop me. I then did my master's in organisational psychology at the University of Lancaster. As part of that, I did an action research project with Marks and Spencer, examining how the cultures and practices on the shop floor could be improved. At the time, they were just experimenting with bringing the sales assistants out from behind the counter and letting the customers choose and pick their own goods. One of my recommendations, which was taken up, was to overcome the vulnerability that the sales assistants felt when they felt unprotected in the open shop floor. So I suggested grouping the tills and forming a bigger counter, which gave the till assistants some of their own space and a bit of protection. That was a novel idea then. Moving on to my proper working life, I got my first job in 1973 as a personnel and training officer for a small storage and distribution company based in Corby, Newtown. It was a good job with good pay and a company car, and involved me travelling all over the country, but living in Corby was really pretty dire. So I moved to London in 1975 and got a job as community relations officer in Lambeth, based in Brixton, when that was the front line for antagonisms between the West Indian community and its tensions with the state, including the police, the education system, social services and social security, immigration and prejudice and discrimination. These were all topics that I was working on. Also, the National Front loved to march in Brixton and hold provocative meetings, and it was a very challenging job, but I loved it. We were setting up projects, taking on the local authority for their racism, especially in the way they allocated housing and in employment issues. I was working with lots of community initiatives, and I set up a job creation scheme for youngsters. I helped set up an emergency accommodation project for homeless teenagers, supported a West Indian Day nursery, an adventure playground, and famously, I challenged the deportation of 3 Ghanaian children, hiding them until I could get blood tests done to prove to the immigration officials that they really were the children of the people who said they were their parents and who were living here legally. I had the local press camped outside my block of flats for a little while. Another interesting run-in was that I was helping to support a Black Rhodesian who was an active trade unionist and who had asylum over here, and a son. He was a single parent, but he was being harassed by the authorities. I rather suspect I had my phone bugged at that time. My next job was as Equal Opportunities Officer for Wandsworth Council. Well, it was decent pay, but I found it totally stultifying. I couldn't wait to get out. So I became Employment Development Officer for NACRO, which is the National Association for the Care and Resettlement of Offenders. I was involved with setting up employment schemes for at-risk youngsters all over the country. I then felt I was ready to run my own organisation and got the job as Chief Executive of what was then called the National Federation of Community Organisations, but I helped them change their name to Community Matters. They supported community associations. So what was the biggest challenge there, other than, of course, fundraising? Well, a big issue for community associations was that they got a lot of their financial support by running social clubs and bars. Unfortunately, the Charity Commission rather annoyingly started taking the view that drinking alcohol was not a charitable activity. So we negotiated with the Charity Commission to enable the bars to be hived off as limited companies, which covenanted their profits back to the charity. A model which was then new, but subsequently was copied by many, many other charities. My next post, starting in 1985, was as Chief Executive of the National Schizophrenia Fellowship. The organisation was in a dire state when I joined. I asked the chair what he wanted me to achieve, and he said that if he could attend the next AGM without a lawyer, he would see that as a success. Well, thankfully we managed to do that, and also to develop lots of new projects for mentally ill people and campaign for better services, including taking a bill through the House of Lords. I was also involved with quite a few media programmes, including an Esther Ransom special, That's Life, on schizophrenia. As all of this was going on in my career, well, how about my personal life? I met my partner, Robert Smith, who many of you know, in 1980. And by 1985, we were trying, unsuccessfully as it turned out, for a family. In the end, I had 5 goes at IVF in 1989-90. And to my delight, on the 5th attempt, when actually we were ready to give up, we were successful. and Emma was born in 1991, followed 2 years later without any IVF by Alice in 1993. So an interesting thing about Emma and Alice is that they were born 1 week apart in the calendar on the 6th and 13th of February, respectively, 2 years apart. But the even greater coincidence is that they were actually born on the same day in the Hebrew calendar, the 22nd of Shvat.
That's nice.
I resigned from the Schizophrenia Fellowship when I was 7 months pregnant with Emma, thinking that my husband was in a secure job, and as I was already 40, I wanted a chance to focus on being a mum. However, at my leaving do, Bob turned up and told me he'd just been made redundant. So, for the first time in my life, and the only time, I had to sign on. There was a downturn in the economy then, and it was easier for me to get a well-paying job. So I got the job as Chief Executive of the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, which, as some of you may know, is a kind of umbrella organisation for the whole voluntary sector. This was a high-profile job and included my making a speech at number 10 Downing Street during a reception attended by the then Prime Minister, John Major, and he appeared to be listening intently, but I don't know if he took any notice. I was also responsible for moving the offices to their current site, behind King's Cross on the canal, now a very trendy place, but then a rather dicey area. However, we were lucky to get Prince Charles to open them, so I met him then. During my time there, the proposals for the Lotteries Bill were going through Parliament, and we did our best to ensure that the voluntary sector would benefit from them. Little did I think that my daughter and son-in-law, some 30 years down the line, would end up being employed by lottery-funded projects. Although I ought to say they've both moved on from that now. Perhaps the biggest impact I had was in suggesting to our legal director that really there should be a structure to enable a charity to become incorporated as a company without having to use the structure meant for commercial organisations, which was really quite inappropriate. Well, I tasked her with working on that in 1992, and she stuck to it. Long after I'd gone, 19 years later, in 2011, the charitable incorporated organisation came into being, and now there are over 17,000 registered through that model. Once Alice came along, it became more difficult to sustain a more than full-time job, and by that time Bob was working full-time. So in 1994, I gave up my full-time job and moved into part-time consultancy work with the charity sector. It was fascinating and varied work, and I could talk forever about it, but I'll try not to. I felt the need to be involved with national policy issues again. So I applied for and was appointed to part-time board positions on 2 quangos. One was called the General Social Care Council and the other one, CAFCAS, Children and Family Court Advisory Support Service. Both were newly set up organisations by the Labour government, and both seemed like a good idea. While the General Social Care Council had an excellent chair and setup, CAFCAS was in crisis from day one, and in so many ways. But most critically of all, it was failing the at-risk children it was supposed to be protecting. I was outspoken about my concerns, and initially at the board level. But when this achieved nothing, I became a whistleblower, which in 2004 led to a massive run-in with the Lord Chancellor, Charlie Faulkner. I can tell you more about that if you want to know. He tried to sack me for giving evidence to a select committee examining the work of CAFCAS. And this led to him being found in contempt of Parliament by the House of Commons Committee on Standards and Privileges. As part of the process, I was discussed on the floor of the House of Commons, and now there is a Weleminsky precedent ruling that the freedom to give evidence must be absolute, and any decision as to whether to accept it and what weight to place on it must be for the select committee alone, not the body to which the witness belongs, not least because there might otherwise be possibility for a majority to present and challenge the false or misleading face to the committee, and thereby subvert the process of parliamentary scrutiny. Well, many whistleblowers find it difficult to maintain employment afterwards because even if you're found to be right, quite often there are problems. Thankfully, the consultancy I worked with were happy to keep me on, so the ruckus and notoriety of my run-in with the Lord Chancellor was not too problematic in the long term. One of my consultancies was with a charity called Macketon Signs and Symbols Language, and I subsequently became a trustee of that for many, many years. My final job before I retired, I went back into full-time work, was as Chief Executive of the Mental Health Providers Forum, an umbrella body for the mental health charities. One of my proudest achievements there was the development of the Mental Health Recovery Star, which I mentioned in my sermon recently, and it's now a widely used tool in the mental health sector. So, having retired in 2011 at the age of 60, I still felt I had some go left in me. So I took a part-time temporary job as Chief Executive of a local children's charity. But when they offered me it on a permanent basis, I decided I had no longer wanted what was effectively a very full-time job. So that eased my transfer into semi-permanent retirement. I felt I could give more to voluntary commitments, and I took on the Honorary Secretary role for the Synagogue Council. And then I took on setting up and leading the Israel Committee, which led to reinvigorating the local Council of Christians and Jews and to the development of the Street Advocacy Initiative, pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. And I also chair the Jewish Resource Centre at the local University of Roehampton, and I'm a trustee of Renaissance Publishing, which produces the excellent magazine Jewish Renaissance. As a counterbalance to being an Israel activist, I learned a new skill as a picture framer. The reason was that I decided that at last it was time to sort out some of the old family paintings of some of my forebears, which I'd accumulated over the years. These were large oil paintings in a very poor state. I got them renovated and then wanted to get them framed. But the picture framer we went to not only didn't like our ideas about picture framing, she also said that for 5 pictures it was going to cost £2,500. So instead I took up a picture framing course at Richmond College and framed them myself. And now they're on our wall and we're enjoying them. I had some fun for a couple of years framing all sorts of things. And finally, how on earth did I get into microbiology work? Well, I'm going to do a whole talk about that for the B'nai B'rith in April. So I'll just give you a very short version. Basically, my cousin Charlotte, age 16 in London in 1943, got TB. That was before the introduction of antibiotics for TB in the late 40s. But her and my grandfather, Judy Weleminsky, had developed at German University in Prague a treatment for TB, which he called tuberclomucin Weleminsky. Apparently it was pretty successful in treating over 1,000 people with it from its discovery in 1912 through till 1938, when with the Anschluss he had to flee from the Nazis. He was in fact just about to go into commercial production, but of course that was kiboshed. Charlotte's mother had brought some of the treatment with her from Prague, and she continued to culture more, growing it live TB in her kitchen in London. Anyway, she successfully treated her daughter and apparently illegally treated many other patients. Charlotte went on to be a GP during her working life, and when she retired, she came across all the papers written in German which had been published about tuberclomucin. She was aware that still a very large number of people die with TB and that there is increasing resistance to antibiotics. So she approached TB researchers to see if someone would take on recreating and testing tuberclomucin. University College London agreed to do so in 2011. But instead of following the instructions for how to produce a substance, they took what they thought was a sensible shortcut, but it wasn't sensible and the project failed. Charlotte was getting very frustrated with them, and being almost 90 and living in Wales, she felt she couldn't carry on. So I agreed to take over chivying the researchers. I met with them and challenged them as to why they hadn't followed my grandfather's instructions for how to develop tuberclomucin. I pointed out to them that my grandfather had said that this substance was destroyed at over 45 degrees, and they had used a substance that had been heated to 100 degrees. I think they were a bit embarrassed. They said the reason they couldn't carry on doing it was because they didn't have people and funding. So I offered to work on a voluntary basis, and much to my surprise, they took me up on my offer. So in 2017, I started training as a microbiologist, and I'm still there now. So that's my story in reasonably brief, and I'm happy to talk about anything that interests you.
Oh, thank you, Judy. That was fantastic.
Yes.
I'm so impressed, I'm speechless. I think that's absolutely wonderful what you've done. Very interesting.
Well done.
And that's at once. So would anybody like to start?
May I?
Yeah, go on.
May I?
Yes, go on, go on.
You don't know me, I'm Judith Ornstein, and Judy left out something very, very important to me, which is that I did a project exposing the shortcomings of the Chakrabarti report. I made a film and a book, and I found Judy because Judy had submitted to the Chakrabarti report and was ignored like all my other witnesses. And she's on film and she's left out her sterling role in the fight against Labour anti-Semitism. So, yeah.
Right.
Thank you, Judith. Really, all the praise goes to you, because those of you who don't know Judith, she is the most amazing activist and fighter for the cause.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes, Jack.
Hi, Judy. Well,
Hi,
it's nice
Jack.
to see a fellow graduate from Birmingham.
Ah,
So, do you know the story of Old Joe?
now I have heard it, but
well, that
remind
won't
us. I know that students used to, Old Joe, for those of you who don't know, is a clock tower in Birmingham. The students used to love getting up there, those who were good at climbing, they're doing stunts up at the top of it. But Jack's going to tell us some more stories.
The background is that Joe Chamberlain, who was a famous politician in Birmingham, went on his honeymoon to Siena. And if you look at that clock, you'll see that it's modelled on the clock tower at Siena. So for those of us who are psychiatrists, it's slightly Freudian. That is what it's about.
The
But
biggest phallic symbol on the campus.
Yes, just thought you'd like to know. But can I ask you a very serious but perhaps challenging question? I mean, well, so if you're testing a drug in the treatment of a disease, you want randomized controlled trials, don't you? And is that part of your work? I mean, are you going to do that?
Yeah, you're a little bit ahead of me. I mean, where I've got to so far is over the last 3 years, I've been growing tuberculosis cultures.
Yes.
And hoping to develop the substance that my grandfather described.
Yes.
I'm happy to say we think we now have it. So the next steps are to do some testing with this substance.
Yes.
We're going to test it on animals, but before I get any animal rights activists at me, we're going to do it with zebrafish larvae to begin with. So nothing too serious. We're also going to do some testing to see what the substance is.
Okay. Excellent.
Can
Good
I-
answer.
Sheila.
May I ask a question? In your very varied life, Judy, have you met up with anti-Semitism at all?
It's a very, very interesting question. When I was young in Leeds, I didn't hit it face on, although actually I think my brother got a bit of problem sometimes. He got quite a bit of bullying, and whether that was anti-Semitic or not, I don't really know. I certainly always felt the odd one out, but nothing too much in my face. I was aware of the fact one wasn't allowed to join local golf clubs, but then I didn't want to, so it didn't bother me. I think the only time that I was really aware of it was in a job, actually, the last job before I retired. 3 of my members of staff were unhappy about the fact that I supported Israel. and they decided to take out a grievance. All of the charges were dismissed. And it was only another colleague who told me, you know, they got together to do that because they didn't like your stance on Israel.
Interesting, isn't it? Yes. I'm finding now that more and more youngsters in professions seem to be saying that they sense anti-Semitism. It's very sad, very sad.
Yes, I mean, if you say you're going on holiday to Israel or you say anything positive about Israel, it's dicey. And I think it's more dicey for youngsters. I mean, obviously now I'm in retirement. I feel fairly free of those pressures, but for young people, it's quite difficult.
Indeed, indeed. Reflection of our times.
Reflection of the past 2,000 years, I think.
I'm just sort of intrigued, Judy, how you became a picture framer. I mean, this is quite a skill. This isn't an easy thing to do. You know, if you're good with woodwork or something, and you know.
Well, I mean, I didn't do it commercially, I ought to say, but the Richmond College, just when I wanted to do it, Richmond College were running a course, and they had some fabulous equipment there. You know, they had a great big £2,000 worth of equipment where you could really clearly chop you up big frames. I think the real ability is the people who make the long pieces of framing, because all you have to do as a picture framer is chop them up. And because the main pictures I wanted to do were oil paintings and they didn't need glass or mounting, really it was a matter of just chopping up the frame. But I had some rather large gold leaf frames put around them, and then I did do a bit of glass cutting and mounting, but I couldn't say that I was ever particularly good at that.
Yeah, because certainly if you're glazing a painting, then you have to worry about the paper, the type of paper you're mounting it on and all the rest of it. But with oil, you still have to do it really well. You can't sort of just cut a bunch of stuff and put a painting in. It doesn't work like that.
And these paintings are quite big. They're a good size.
Can we see?
If I was in the other room, I could show you a picture of them.
Shame. Yeah, would love to see one.
Yeah.
Maxine, you
if I can say,
and then we'll have Claudia.
Okay, just on a lighter note, during this period of isolation which I've had to be in, which we all have, I've taken up adult painting by numbers. And I wish I would have known you did picture framing, because I've just had to order this massive frame for this beautiful artwork that I've created. It's I can really recommend it. It's really relaxing and therapeutic and very rewarding. Whereas, you know, a jigsaw, you have to fold up back in the box. Once you've done this, you've created something. So had I have known you were a picture frame, I would have contacted you.
I have to say, I'm now a retired picture framer.
Well, if you ever want to come back to it, Judy, after you accomplish your microbiology ambitions, in Canada, there were these shops called You Frame It shops, where there's a person who helps people make their own frames. Oh. So maybe that's something you might want to be involved in. But, you know, the microbiology is much more urgent, I think. But
I might say, who knows, I might save some lives, which would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, Paula.
So is you know, I remember meeting a research scientist many years ago, and he said that tuberculosis was on the rise then. I mean, I'd always assumed that since it was treatable, you know, with antibiotics, that in fact it was hopefully going to be a thing of the past, but clearly it isn't.
There's a lot of it in South Africa, apparently. There has been for, you know, decades. It's rife.
Well, that's right. I mean, Africa and Asia, there's about 1.7 million people a year die with TB. So I know now there are more COVID, but it's pretty big and it's every year. In this country, it's not so many, but increasingly we have a problem with antibiotic resistance. So it's a worry. And there aren't many new antibiotics coming along.
Exactly, that's the major problem, that the resistance against the antibiotics we already had. So you're basically working with microbes in a petri dish, and
no, in liquid, in growing culture.
but it's but in vitro. Okay,
In vitro,
so
yeah.
you have an in vitro environment, and you are trying out your whatever it is, and the new antibiotic or the new drug, whatever. I mean, and you have been developing that drug yourself.
Yes.
Wow.
So I mean, my grandfather, it feels a bit like I'm looking for lost treasure, but I've got a map. So my grandfather left full instructions as to how the substance was to be developed, and it was basically a matter of growing TB. You had to select the right strain, but I think we happened on a good strain, and you had to grow it for at least 18 months. And it forms biofilms on the surface of the liquid, and you keep shaking these off. And eventually, after a certain period, the biofilms die back, and this substance appears in the liquid.
And the
Where are you learning microbiology, Judy?
I'm sorry.
Are you studying microbiology now, like
Well,
formally?
I'm not doing
I'm
not doing a formal academic qualifications or anything like that. It's a bit more like my picture framing. I'm learning hands-on. So I'm working in a category 3 lab, because you have to do that if you're working with a dangerous organism like tuberculosis and Mycobacteria tuberculosis. And I haven't started the trials with the zebrafish yet, but that will be with zebrafish larvae, so tiny things in small assays.
Why did you choose zebrafish? Why did you choose zebrafish? What's the advantage of that animal model? I mean, there are so many other animal models. For example, I don't know, chicks.
Right, so that's an interesting question. So the zebrafish have become quite fashionable as test animals, because during the early part of their life, they're transparent and you can see what's going on. And up to 5 days old, the larvae is not protected by the animal rights legislation. So after that, you've got to get lots of complex formal permissions and so on, even for just ordinary zebrafish. But up to 5 days old, you can do tests without that paperwork, without the bureaucracy. They don't get TB because, of course, TB is a respiratory disease, among other things, and zebrafish don't have lungs. But they do get a Mycobacteria marinum, which is not dissimilar, apparently, to Mycobacteria tuberculosis. And they, so we think that it might be interesting to do that testing. I mean, ideally, my grandfather worked with a lot of guinea pigs. Famously, he wrote down which guinea pig was the first one to survive with his treatment. I think you won't believe the number. It was number 1,769. So he worked with thousands of guinea pigs, testing his substance on them. And after he finished working with guinea pigs, he then moved on to cattle. And of course, we have a big problem with TB in cattle at the moment in this country. But nobody's going to let me anywhere near cows with my substance until I've gone through lots of other testing first.
Very good.
Judy, who are you working with? Are you doing this by yourself? Are you working with a team? You talked about sort of a lab 3. Yeah. So who are you working with, and where is the lab?
It's part of the University College London, but the lab is actually based at the Royal Free Hospital. So I'm in the Centre for Clinical Microbiology, and I was working to the professor there, but now I'm moving on, and I'm working now with actually somebody who's a lecturer at the Eastman Dental College, but they're going to be based in the same place.
You didn't study science at school, did you?
No, actually I did. I did do science A levels, but that's the last time I did science. I did maths, chemistry and biology, and I often ask myself why on earth I did them. But maybe it had some use.
Yeah. So what did you do at A levels?
Maths, chemistry, biology.
Oh, you did at A levels. Oh, well, there you are. So that's
But
it.
then I went on to do psychology and left that all behind.
Yeah, I understand.
But so, Judy, did you do behavioral psychology? Because if you did, you would have been working with animals as well, wouldn't you?
Spot on. I was working with mice. We had beautiful white rats actually at Birmingham University. I don't know whether you're allowed to work with them now. The rules weren't so strict then. But yes, I was doing behavioral psychology. Quite right.
Did you grow up in a strictly kosher household then?
Yep.
Yeah.
My mother kept meat and milk separate, and all the meat was koshered. But my brother, who many of you know became ultra olfactorady, he got to the point where my mother's level of kashrus wasn't enough for him. So there are levels and levels.
Yeah.
We kept, I think, an hour between meat and milk, and my brother then started keeping 3 hours between meat and milk. And when he met his wife, they agreed on 6 hours between meat and milk.
Oh, really? Oh dear. Oh dear.
It differs by country.
Oh, Beit Shemesh. They're living in Israel in Beit Shemesh. Yeah.
Not in Beit Shemesh, in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Oh, in Jerusalem. Okay. Jack, did you want to say something?
Well, yes. I mean, you're brought up to a considerable degree in Yorkshire, and you lived in Pontefract. Where did you go to school then?
In Pontefract. Pontefract and District Girls High School.
Yes, famous.
Was that an 11 plus one, Judy?
I'm sorry?
Was that 11 plus?
Yeah, 11 plus, yeah. I went to a primary school in Castleford because we were on the border of it. When I was growing up, I was led to believe that Pontefract was vastly superior to Castleford. I was very upset to realise I was going to a school in Castleford, but I don't quite know what that superiority was based on.
You have to be careful what you say, because my wife went to school in Castleford. To the Castleford Grammar School, yeah.
Oh, really? Right.
Sorry, what was that? No, I was going to say, I got Pontefract is associated with licorice in my mind. Is that right?
Yes. Licorice apparently needs 7 foot deep of good soil, and apparently you had that in Pontefract. But I don't think they grow licorice there anymore. The Bassex licorice, all sorts came from there, and so on.
Chaim, you're muted if you wanted to say something.
I thought I unmuted myself. I was asking if Judy ever considered making Aliyah to Israel.
That's a very good question. I tell you, when I was younger, 2 things put me off. One is I'm really dreadful in the heat. And for me, Israel was always too hot. I mean, I think it's better now, so much air conditioning. But when I went there as a youngster, I felt like I was expiring most of the time. Secondly, my language skills are really poor. And so I never really got the hang of speaking any sensible Hebrew. So it didn't seem the right thing for me when I had a good career here. And now I've got my family here. But yes, it would be interesting to live in Israel. I would have been. It's something I've often thought about, but never seemed reasonable to do.
Well, if you want to, if anybody's interested, in 2 weeks' time, I will be taking the place of Judy and presenting my background to those who want to listen. And we did make Aliyah. I made Aliyah, I should say. Ella didn't. Ella's grandfather made Aliyah, but that's a different story. That'll be when Ella's turn comes to talk, she can mention him. Yes, so I've been around Israel and here and Israel and here and so on, but there we are. That's in 2 weeks. So I'll do my little advert now.
Excellent, looking forward to it.
Thank you. Maxine, yes, did you want to say something?
No, I just nodded to look forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you.
It was, Judy, it was very successful. I think it worked well. And I have a feeling that we've all enjoyed this thoroughly. And it indeed is nice to get to know one another.
Indeed, thank you. So if nobody would like to add anything, I trust my job to say thank you very, very much for Judy for her excellent talk on today. And thank everybody else for coming and listening to it and with your questions. And I really do hope to see you and others, whoever wants to come along in 2 weeks' time. And then 2 weeks after that, we have Jack Steinert doing it. And if these talks are successful, which they seem to be at the moment, and I hope it carries on like this, then we will expect most of you to come along and give some talks because we're looking forward to it. Everybody's background and history is interesting, so it's wonderful. Anyway,